Hello, welcome back to Tea and Bedtime Stories. I hope you found Chapter 1 of A Farewell to Arms as thrilling as I did. Sarcasm intended. I have a feeling the story is going to start to pick up. Fingers crossed. My name is Tricia Sulpizio. I'm your host for Tea and Bedtime Stories, a podcast for anyone who can appreciate a good book. And again, let's hope this is one. So in this episode, I will continue to read the widely popular novel by Ernest Hemingway, A Farewell to Arms, first published in 1929. In the last installment, we read Book 1, Chapter 1, and now I will continue reading Book 1, Chapter 2. After I finish the chapter, I'll follow up with quick facts for clarification and a brief commentary about my impressions of this story. And I would love to hear your thoughts as well. But for now, let's get into Book 1, Chapter 2. The next year, there were many victories. The mountain that was beyond the valley and the hillside where the chestnut forest grew was captured, and there were victories beyond the plain and on the plateau to the south. And we crossed the river in August, and I lived in a house in Gorizia that had a fountain and many thick shady trees in a walled garden and a wisteria vine, purple on the side of the house. Now the fighting was in the next mountains beyond, and was not a mile away. The town was very nice, and our house was very fine. The river ran behind us, and the town had been captured very handsomely, but the mountains beyond it could not be taken, and I was very glad. The Austrians seemed to want to come back to this town sometime, if the war should end, because they did not bombard it to destroy it, but only a little and in a military way. People lived on in it, and there were hospitals and cafes and artillery up side streets and 2 body houses, one for troops and one for officers. And with the end of the summer, the cool nights, the fighting in the mountains beyond the town, the shell-marked iron of the railway bridge, the smashed tunnel by the river where the fighting had been, the trees around the square and the long avenue of trees that led to the square, these with there being girls in the town, the king passing in his motor car, sometimes now seeing his face and a little long-necked body and gray beard like a goat's chin tuft. All these with all the sudden interiors of houses that had lost a wall through shelling, with plaster and rubble in their gardens and sometimes in the street, and the whole thing going well on the Carso, made the fall very different from the last fall when we had been in the country. The war was changing too. The forest of oak trees on the mountain beyond the town was gone. The forest had been green in the summer when we had come into the town, but now there were stumps and the broken trunks and the ground torn up. And one day at the end of the fall, when I was out there where the oak forest had been, I saw a cloud coming over the mountain. It came very fast, and the sun went dull, yellow, and then everything was gray, and the sky was covered, and the cloud came down on the mountain, and suddenly we were in it. It was snow. The snow slanted across the wind, and bare ground was covered. The stumps of trees projected. There was snow on the guns, and there were paths in the snow, going back to the latrines behind trenches. Later, below in the town, I watched the snow falling, looking out of the window of the body house, the house for officers where I sat with a friend, and 2 glasses, drinking a bottle of Asti, and looking out at the snow falling slowly and heavily. We knew it was all over for that year. Up the river, the mountain had not been taken. None of the mountains beyond the river had been taken. That was all left for next year. My friend saw the priest from our mess going by in the street, walking carefully in the slush, and pounded on the window to attract his attention. The priest looked up. He saw us and smiled. My friend mentioned to him to come in. The priest shook his head and went on. That night in the mess, after the spaghetti course, which everyone ate very quickly and seriously, lifting the spaghetti on the fork until the loose strands hung clear, then lowering it into the mouth, or else using a continuous lift and sucking into the mouth, helping ourselves to wine from the grass-covered gallon flask. It swung in a metal cradle, and if you pulled the neck and flask down with a forefinger in the wine, clear red, tonic, and lovely, poured out into the glass held with the same hand. After this course, the captain commenced picking on the priest. The priest was young and blushed easily and wore a uniform like the rest of us, but with a cross in dark red velvet above the left breast pocket of his gray tunic. The captain spoke Pidgin, P-I-D-G-I-N, Italian for my doubtful benefit, in order that I might understand perfectly that nothing should be lost. Priest, today with girls, the captain said, looking at the priest and at me. The priest smiled and blushed and shook his head. This captain baited him often. Not true, asked the captain. Today I see priests with girls. No, said the priest. The officers were amused at the baiting. Priest not with girls, went on the captain. Priest never with girls, he explained to me. He took my glass and filled it, looking at my eyes all the time, but not losing sight of the priest. Priest, every night, 5 against 1. Everyone at the table laughed. You understand? Priest, every night, 5 against 1. He made a gesture and laughed loudly. The priest accepted it as a joke. The Pope wants the Austrians to win the war, the major said. He loves Franz Joseph. That's where the money comes from. I'm an atheist. Did you ever read The Black Pig? Asked the lieutenant. I will get you a copy. It was that which shook my faith. It is a filthy and vile book, said the priest. You do not really like it. It is very valuable, said the lieutenant. It tells you about those priests. You like it, he said to me. I smiled at the priest, and he smiled back across the candlelight. Don't you read it, he said. I will get it for you, said the lieutenant. All thinking men are atheists, the major said. I do not believe in the Freemasons, however. I believe in the Freemasons, the lieutenant said. It is a noble organization. Someone came in, and as the door opened, I could see the snow falling. There will be no more offense now that the snow has come, I said. Certainly not, said the major. You should go on leave. You should go to Rome, Naples, Sicily. He should visit Amalfi, said the lieutenant. I will write you cards to my family in Amalfi. They will love you like a son. He should go to Palermo. He ought to go to Capri. I would like you to see Abruzzi and visit my family at Capricotta, said the priest. Listen to him talk about the Abruzzi. There's more snow there than here. He doesn't want to see peasants. Let him go to the centers of culture and civilization. He should have fine girls. I will give you the addresses of places in Naples, beautiful young girls, accompanied by their mothers. He looked at the priest and shouted, Every night, priest, 5 against 1. They all laughed again. You must go on. Leave at once, the major said. I would like to go with you and show you things, the lieutenant said. When you come back, bring a phonograph. Bring good opera discs. Bring Caruso. Don't bring Caruso, he bellows. Don't you wish you could bellow like him? He bellows. I say he bellows. I would like you to go to Abruzzi, the priest said. The others were shouting. There is good hunting. You will like the people, and though it is cold, it is clear and dry. You could stay with my family. My father is a famous hunter. Come on, said the captain. We go whorehouse before it shuts. Good night, I said to the priest. Good night, he said. Okay, well, that was interesting. The soldiers moved to Gorizia. Funnily, it's a prehistoric city located at the base of the Alps. It was the first city that Italy liberated or subsumed from the Austro-Hungarian territory. That happened in 1916, and they were very proud of that accomplishment because this was a hard-fought war. But it's interesting that he was in a body house as if it were nothing. That was kind of interesting. But I guess to them at that time, it wasn't that big of a deal. In fact, according to the International Encyclopedia of the First World War, prostitution was sanctioned by military officials, especially in France and Germany. Prostitutes, they thought it would be better if they had their own prostitutes, and they could register them as sex workers instead of just like black market dealings, because they could put them under regular medical examinations. The authorities at that time feared that soldiers would become incapacitated if there was widespread uncontrolled venereal disease, and they thought, I'm sure, that it was more prudent to just control the trade on their side than it would be to just let things run rampantly. I know that the United States and Great Britain did publicly outlaw the practice, and they called for abstinence, but they also quietly sanctioned their activities by setting up medical stations to treat the soldiers who were using these body houses. And they did have separate ones for the officer class, obviously fewer patrons than the enlisted class body houses. But it's just kind of an interesting little side note to the war, I guess. Also, the term 5 against 1 is this silly colloquialism for what most people in the modern world inaccurately define as onanism, if you know what I mean. I think it's stupid and hilarious. 5 against 1. It's kind of stupid and hilarious that you was saying that to a priest. I'm sorry, I just find that amusing. But I say inaccurate, sorry, off the subject, but it's inaccurate to use the term onanism if you know where that word originated, because it's purportedly rooted in a Bible story and an entire religious doctrine around this story of Onan. He was the son of Judah. He had an older brother named It's in Genesis 38. And it describes basically the story of the lineage. So was Judah's son. He was married to a woman named Tamar. And God didn't like so he killed And then Judah implored or commissioned his younger son, Onan, to take Tamar as his wife, have children with her, procreate with her, so that there would be an heir apparent to Judah's inheritance. Well, Onan wanted to keep the inheritance for himself, but he did take advantage of the situation, and he married or was with Tamar, but he didn't follow through with his mission. We'll just say that. And God considered that egregious and killed Onan too. Genesis 38 is an interesting story. The entire chapter reads like a 3-act play. I highly recommend somebody write that because it's fascinating to see so much intrigue in so few words. But I highly recommend reading it to anyone, whether you're religious or not. It's very dramatic storytelling. But if you read the story of Onan, more importantly, you'll know that it has nothing to do, his story has very little to do or nothing to do with the 5 against 1 definition of onanism, if you know what I'm saying. So there's clearly errors in its interpretation, and again, there's a whole doctrine built around that, which is just completely made up. Anyway, I digress. So, the language of pidgin, Pidgin. I apologize if that was off-putting for me to clarify that in the middle of the chapter reading, but it was a language that was more spoken by common people. Italian was kind of invented for the aristocratic class, and so it didn't really trickle down until people started talking about having their own voice or their own rights within the government. So, the chapter does also mention Franz Joseph. He was the Emperor of Austria and the person who started World War I. Basically, I'll tell you the story. Sorry, a little tangent. But Franz Joseph was the Emperor of Austria. Austria was the oldest imperial dynasty in Europe at that time, or in the world at that time. And even though they were old and crippling, they still wanted to try to keep up with France, Great Britain, and the United States, right? The Industrial Revolution was happening at this time, and they just couldn't keep up. It was a state of it was multicultural in every way, and they had just lost Serbia in earlier fighting and wanted it back. So Franz Joseph had lost his sons, and so he had no heir apparent. So they had to go down the line of succession to his nephew, who he didn't like. His nephew married a commoner, and Franz Joseph went out of his way to make sure that their children would never be in succession for the Austrian kingdom. And so it's very apparent that to me, it seems very apparent that he kind of said he didn't like his nephew. He wanted his other nephew to take over. He sent the first one, the Archduke, to Serbia to piss them off with no security, and he survived one assassination attempt, and then like an hour later finally got killed. And then Franz Joseph used that as an excuse to try to attack Serbia. Serbia enlisted the help of Russia to defend them. Then Austria enlisted Germany, and that started the whole World War. Anyway, it's interesting that they were saying that the Pope of that time was in love with Franz Joseph, and that's where all the money came from. Interesting historical facts. There's nothing to support that, but I find that kind of an interesting, that was their impression of what was happening. So obviously they were fairly well educated on politics of that time. But the soldiers that were talking about different places in Italy where he should go and visit Amalfi is in southern Italy. It's on the Gulf of Salerno. Palermo is the capital city of Sicily on the northern coast. So again, that's more beach. And Capri is an island near the Bay of Naples. And then contrast to that is the Abruzzi region, where the priest's family lived in Capricotta. And so there's some contrast between where they said that he should go versus what the priest was saying. So anyway, just geographically. Okay, so Enrico Caruso was, who they mentioned, the whaler, was an Italian opera singer. When they talked about Caruso, I chose O Sole Mio because as the theme song for this podcast, for this series, for Farewell to Arms, because it was recorded in 1916. And it was a romantic love song, the same type that Ernest grew up playing. His mother was a former professional opera singer and his music teacher, so I'm sure he was familiar with Caruso. Notice the character didn't comment on it, but I find that kind of interesting. And so not to put a feather in my own cap, but I think that's kind of interesting that that was the theme song that I chose and that they mention it in chapter 2. So yeah, mention the artist, I'll say. So my impressions of the chapter, I think it's starting to get a little bit better. And I think, as I mentioned, there was some contrast between the high mountains where they wanted him to visit and the beach cities where the officers suggested he go on leave. And when I was researching Hemingway and his writing, what most people talked about were these counterpoints that his writing tries to insert a lot of dichotomies or representations of opposites, basically. And I wasn't sure how that would play out in the writing, but I get what they're talking about now, right? The contrast between the priest's celibacy and the men, fully engaged or promoting prostitution, right? It's kind of the sanctification versus defilement, talking about the Pope and then being an atheist, right? There's so many, and again, even the contrast between the mountains and the beach, like every point, there's a counterpoint immediately following. And so it's kind of ingenious that he uses those polarizations to highlight different aspects of human, reality. I also think it's kind of interesting in light of the fact that Ernest was a manic depressive, and those are two extremes. I can't help but think that he had difficulty integrating those two extremes, right? The different parts of himself as one thing. And so dealing with each extreme separately was probably a lot more manageable for him, right? If he was feeling depressed, he probably just leaned into that until that passed, and then knowing that an upswing or a manic period of hyperactivity would follow, just leaned into that. And dichotomies can be really helpful in helping us make characterizations about different things in real life. But in our interpersonal relationships, I think they really diminish our critical listening skills because we have a tendency to evaluate people in their simplest form. And it's not accurate because we are all everything, all at once, all the time. There is no separation of person. I think we just choose, or we involuntarily manifest different aspects of ourselves at different times, but it doesn't mean those dichotomies don't exist within each person. So yeah, we're never just a goody two-shoes. We're never, just an immoral brute, right? We are all capable of all of those things all of the time. Hopefully we have learned some self-control and we don't manifest those things when it's inappropriate, but just knowing that those things are always there, I find comforting. Anyway, sorry, that was a little deep, but that concludes my thoughts on chapter 2. In the next episode, I'll continue the reading with book 1, chapter 3 of A Farewell to Arms. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to submit your queries, suggestions, and insights. I want to assure you that any and all constructive feedback will be greatly appreciated. I know for a fact that criticism is never constructive, but suggestions usually are. Anyway, I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for listening.